In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. So topic 6 is the focus is on decluttering. And so when you're speaking about order, clutter is the things that disrupts the order, the things that prevents us from being able to see things clearly, being able to focus on the things that are the most important, because there are so many things that we are trying to focus on, and maybe hindering us from setting our priorities. So what are some kinds of decluttering that we need? The first is the spiritual decluttering. Spiritual decluttering meaning my focus on to see if my relationship with God is right or not. What is lacking in it? Maybe I'm scattered and distracted in my spiritual life, and this is preventing me from seeing things correctly. And actually, we can be spiritually cluttered, actually even involved in too much service. Like a person who is very involved in service thinks that they are, spiritually strong, thinking that they are close to God because they go to church often, because they're involved in many activities and Sunday school and whatnot. But actually, this can be also a distraction. If this is becoming for me a substitute for having a strong private relationship with God, something that I do on my own apart from kind of corporate activity that we do in the church, this can also be a distraction, or at least something that is keeping me from realizing or observing or seeing that there is a problem. Regular repentance is very important. A way for us to measure kind of our spiritual progress is how often are we going to confess? How often are we self-reflecting? Are we examining our hearts? Are we seeing what is it that the failures that I'm committing, the weaknesses that I have, the things that I want to grow and work on, in order for me to kind of put away the baggage, the things that are affecting me, the things that are...
Well, I think it's up there.
The things that are weighing down on me.
Is it still doing?
The things that are weighing down on me, the things that are on my heart, and that these things are a distraction because I feel like something's wrong, but I don't deal with it or take care of it quickly. I maybe go through my life, sometimes for years, with sins that have not been repented of, with difficult problems that I haven't exposed to the light, secrets and hidden things that might be a problem. And so that's definitely something that I have to address in order for me to be able to focus on my spiritual life. Okay. I mentioned part of this is self-examination. Sometimes we don't examine ourselves very often or very thoroughly, and so we tend not to know ourselves, or we want to escape kind of private time with ourselves by distracting ourselves with a lot of different activities and things and talk, so we can kind of get away from this idea of examining myself. Sometimes we focus just on the same sins, maybe that we've been committing for a long time, or the big sins that are obvious to us. But the person who is able to really examine their motives and their intentions, they start to notice maybe smaller or subtle things that is a problem. If you use the example of you have a bed sheet that, or any kind of white sheet that has stains on it, when you wash it, the first stains that you're going to notice are gone, are like the big stains. And then at that point, some people say, well, I'm fine, I'm good. I'm not committing adultery, or I'm not taking drugs, or I'm not, murdering anyone. All right, so I'm okay. And their spiritual progress stops at this point. But the person who is really successful in their spiritual life is the one who can continue to go deeper and examine themselves more and more, and now start to see the smaller stains and continue to wash, continue to cleanse until they become more and more clean. So addressing our negative attitudes is, for instance, an example. Like gossip is an example, jealousy is an example, lust of the eyes is an example. The language that we use, the judgment maybe that we have, any manifestation of aggression, a lack of humility, a lot of these things that can plague us that we don't really pay much attention to because we're focusing on the big things. And, if I feel like I don't have these things, then I feel fine. So this also helps us get in tune with ourselves, helps us get in tune with God, and is a type of spiritual decluttering. Simplifying practices, right? Like focus on the most foundational things that we need to do. What are the basics that we need to do? The spiritual life, when you really think about it, is actually extremely simple. I mean, the hard part about it is our willpower to do it. But the actual practice itself is simple. God is not asking us to do something complex or something that only a small group of people are able to do, people with advanced degrees or people of high intellect or people who are extremely strong physically, or anyone, even a child, can do spiritual practices. Like when we talk about praying, talking to God, we talk about repenting, just saying, I'm sorry about the things that I've done and confessing my sins, going to church and taking communion. And these things are actually not difficult to do. And we tend to complicate our lives by trying to do a lot of things that maybe are distracting us. Focusing on these foundational things and making them a priority and not compromising them. Not compromising my spiritual practice no matter what happens, right? Because this is this foundation, the simple foundation of everything that I do. This is very, very important. Also, removing idols, right? Idols are a big reason why we might be separated from God. Why our hearts might be turned away from God because of something that I desire, something that I love that is not God, that I love more than God, right? Something that I spend all of my mind, my time on, something that I wish that I had or want to attain, or I'm unwilling to let go of, right? So much, even if it contradicts God's will for my life. So we have to identify these idols, right? Determining what takes precedence over God in our lives. And a big way to do that is to look at how we spend our time, right? I think Tony was talking about the other day about the kind of exercise that his work had them do and write down how you use all your time. That is a good way to determine what you love the most, right? What you love the most is going to be, not determined by the answer that you give when people ask you, because we tend to give, like the very obvious answers. Oh, I love God the most. But the real answer is, where do we spend our time the most? What do our thoughts meditate on the most? What are the things that we talk about the most? All these are a reflection of where our heart is and what we really care about the most. And that will help us to identify idols. Idols are the things that take us away from God, but idols don't necessarily have to be sinful intrinsically in and of themselves. For instance, a recreational activity that I do that in itself is not wrong, but consumes so much of my time that keeps me from wanting to do the spiritual things or from wanting to spend time with family or serving other people. This can become an idol to me, even though in itself there's nothing wrong with it. The hardest part about, godliness is moderation, right? Because it's sometimes easier to say, I'm going to cut out something completely or do something excessively. But to find a balance in the middle is I'm going to do something, but only enough. I'm going to do something, but then I know when to stop. This is actually difficult. It's like if you take a few bites of food when you're hungry, and then you say, I'm going to stop, right? That's almost harder than not even having started to eat, right? When you're involved in doing something you enjoy, being able to set, a limit and say, now I'm going to stop this, and now I'm going to start something else that is important. This is an important tenet of time management, of so much of what we're talking about here, of being able to give everything the amount of time that it needs, right? To not cut out anything, but to also say, I'm not going to let something rule over me, have control over me. When we speak about fasting, this is what it's teaching us. How is it that I can do something while at the same time having control over it? not allowing my desires to consume me, to take over, and then to cause me to live an unbalanced life. So these idols that maybe we struggle with in various ways, each of us, is an important part of this spiritual decluttering. And then reordering our priorities, right? So once we identify the idols, how do we cut them out? How do we reduce the time that we spend doing on these things that have become idols, and instead reprioritize that time into something else, right? That's an important part of this, like not just identifying what's wrong, but now coming up with a real plan of how to change. The change is the hardest part, right? But the first step is identifying the problem, confessing the problem, talking about with our Father confession about, I feel like I'm spending too much time, watching TV, whatever. And I feel like it's taking me away from prayer, it's taking away from my family, and maybe some of the things that I'm watching on TV, even if I don't intend it, is not edifying. Some of the things that I'm hearing is not edifying. It's having a negative effect on my life, and I want to change, right? So at that point, actually saying, I am going to make a schedule for myself. Sometimes we live without schedules, or we have schedules and work, and we don't want to also have how to schedule my free time. But scheduling my free time is sometimes necessary, right? Because I want to limit myself. Maybe my natural inclination is to, live life a certain way that can actually be harmful. And I have to rein myself in and say, I'm going to control that. How am I going to replace these idols with something that is godly, with something that is beneficial? Even, for instance, saying instead of watching, a secular movie, I'm going to watch a Christian movie. Instead of spending, this amount of time, on YouTube or whatever, I'm going to reduce it. Small steps that I can take to start to take control back again of my life. And as this is a very personal process, but it's also a process that as a family, right, the family can do together, right? Because as a family, you can look at your family and say, you know what, in general, we all spend too much time watching movies. We all spend too much time doing whatever it is that's not edifying. And so we need to make a system to help encourage all of us, both me, my wife, my kids, to make better choices. And so this starts with you as an individual, right? To set that standard for yourself, because like we've been saying all throughout the weekend, you shouldn't be telling your kids to do something that you're not doing yourself. It's not going to work. You set the standard first for yourself, and you say, I choose to live my life with certain limits, with certain principles, because I find that this life is drawing me closer to God. And then once you have that experience, and you say, now I'm going to apply that, with wisdom and discernment to my entire family. Maybe not the exact rules that you put for yourself, but something that makes sense for each person. Something that's going to help, our kids grow, something that's going to help our wife, something that's going to help our family as a whole to kind of maintain and grow toward God instead of growing away from Him, again, with this kind of spiritual noise. Another important element of this spiritual decluttering is to get rid of hatred and grudges. This is another thing that maybe we carry with us throughout our life. We have wounds from previous relationships, from things that happened at work, from people at church, from family members or friends. And as we go through life, we accumulate these, right? Because the longer you live, the more opportunities there are for pain and for carrying burdens with us. And so it's up to us at each stage whether I'm going to continue to carry these burdens, going to continue to carry hatred and anger and resentment toward people, or I'm going to let those things go. And when we let them go, we are not saying that they weren't important. We weren't saying, we sometimes don't want to let them go because we want to justify our hatred towards certain people. We find the idea that showing love, or even in our mind, not hating a certain person for what they did, we find that almost like an abomination. It's so becomes such a part of who I am, is I have so much pain that I have to live with on a daily basis because of something that this person did, and so I justify that I would hate them and that I would even fantasize about this hatred. And we carry this hatred with us, which it becomes a big obstacle between us and God, as well as us and other people, trusting others, being free to love other people, right? If my heart is consumed with hatred for this person over here, how am I going to show love then to my family? How am I going to love my friends? How am I going to love God if all of my focus is distracted with hating? So embracing forgiveness is very important. And again, there's a process of self-reflection, right? Who do I need to forgive? Who are the people that I really haven't forgiven? This is also one of those things where you ask people, it's like, oh, did you forgive this person? The gut reaction answer is yes. Yes. Nobody wants to admit that they haven't forgiven. No one wants to admit that they hate. But the reality is we do, right? Forgiveness, again, doesn't mean being friends again, right? Forgiveness doesn't mean like we're completely reconciled again as before. But forgiveness at least means that I'm not harboring resentment or anger or hatred towards you. I'm joyful for your successes. I don't want to see you fail. I'm constantly fantasizing about all the bad things that can happen to you and extracting some kind of pleasure from that, if that were to happen. So first figure out who is it that you really haven't forgiven and be honest with yourself about it, because you're going to find, yes, there are people who have not forgiven. Also, seeking forgiveness, right? I myself, I'm in need of forgiveness. And maybe one of the ways that we forgive others is to identify that we also maybe are hated by others. We also have hurt others. We also have failed others. Our weaknesses have affected others. And so I also need to be forgiven. And if there's someone that maybe I haven't apologized to for something that I've done, even if it's years ago, right, then I should seriously consider contacting that person. Be like, a long time ago, such and such happened, and I just want to say that this has been on my heart for a long time. I want to ask for your forgiveness for it because I was wrong when I did such and such. That's it. And actually, it doesn't even matter whether they accept the apology or not. And again, this isn't about necessarily reconciliation, right? This is about just clearing our conscience that we asking people for forgiveness for anything that we've done wrong, just as we would want also them to do the same when they have hurt us. Also, creating a forgiving environment, like in the family, okay? The difference between in the family and out of the family. So out of the family, if you're going to forgive someone, but you don't want to reconcile, okay, you don't have to reconcile. But in the family, you have to reconcile. Like there's no choice. I mean, if you don't reconcile in the family, this is what divorce is, okay? So you forgive and you have to reconcile, meaning we have to come back again. We have to restore the relationship again. We have to deal with this hurt through, forgiveness, but also we have to continue and grow stronger in our relationship together. And this can happen between the man and the woman. It can happen between the parents and the children. It can happen between the children, the siblings together. So creating an environment where forgiveness is expected, right? An environment where it is expected that sometimes unfortunately and unintentionally we hurt one another, or maybe sometimes intentionally we hurt one another, but that there's always an expectation that we are not going to let the sun go down on our anger. We're going to deal with this. We're not going to allow ourselves to just remain at odds with one another, angry with one another. And one of the most harmful things that I see is when these kinds of things just go unaddressed, right? Like maybe our emotions have calmed down, like we're not fighting, we're not fuming at each other, but we also haven't resolved it. Like whatever it is that was said, no one said, I'm sorry. No one said, I shouldn't have said that. There's been no resolution really to the conflict. But our emotions have kind of calmed down and we're so busy and we just go on with our lives and nothing. And so we don't mention it again. From the outside, it looks like everything is normal. It looks like everything has been resolved, but it hasn't been resolved. And actually that's just, like a tick mark that you put there in that relationship. And then the next time this happens, it's another tick mark. And the third time, it's another tick mark. And eventually, when you have enough, then there's an explosion, right? The resentment builds slowly over time because none of these things are addressed. And so it's very hard to, to forget about them. That's why having conversations about our conflicts, about how we have hurt each other is very important. And, there's some people that they want to flee this conflict, the conflict avoidance, or the avoiding of the discussion about the conflict that we've had. And there's other people that just want to talk about it immediately. I'm sure we've all experienced this. Usually there's one of each in every relationship. There's the person who just wants to deal with the problem immediately, instantly, as soon as possible, because they just want to clear it up. And then the other person is the one who wants to run away from this conversation. They don't want to have this conversation. The conversation stresses them out. They just want to avoid it. And sometimes sometimes it's the man on each side or the woman on each side. It could be either one, right? And so the challenge here is, how do we make a system again for ourselves to agree that whenever we have conflict, we're always going to talk about it, right? Maybe we can't talk about it immediately. Maybe people need to calm down a little bit, but we're going to set a time for us to talk about it. We're going to say, okay, we can't talk about it today, but we're going to talk about it tomorrow at 5 p.m. or whatever time, okay? That way, the person who normally flees from these conversations knows that there is a reckoning, there is a time that we're going to have. And the person who wants to have the conversation immediately at least knows that there's a time scheduled for it, even though it's not going to be right now. It's kind of a compromise between the two extremes. But that in this conversation, and there's whole books written about this, but in this conversation, we're going to talk to each other calmly with gentleness. We're going to do the active listening. We're going to, try to understand each other's point of view. We're not going to blame, all the things that we've talked about and more in this conversation, to try to reconcile and remember that we are not enemies, because sometimes we believe that we're enemies. We are fundamentally against each other, but no, actually we're on the same team. We just see things differently, or maybe somebody messed up and did something they shouldn't have. How do we reconcile? Reconciliation is an art, and it's very important as something that we need to create that environment where reconciliation is expected, right? And that's up to us to do. Number 4 is cleansing, and maybe looking even at the Bible for kind of symbols and meditations on the cleansing. Christ, when he cleansed the temple, what is it that he did? He removed hindrances to worship. He removed hindrances to approaching God, to making sacrifice. And that's why, you never see Christ acting this way at any other time in his ministry. If the account of Christ overturning the tables of the money changers was not actually in the Bible, and then somebody came to you and said, do you think that Christ could actually go to a place and in his anger, overturn tables? Probably everyone would say no. I don't think Jesus would do that. That's not Christ-like, right? Maybe because we don't see necessarily any example of anything like this, but we see it, right? So it tells us that the same God who is meek and gentle and loving and merciful and all the things that he is, he's also the God who is very bold about removing obstacles for people to worship God. And what was happening here is that these money changers in the temple, everyone would come to the temple at different times of the year to offer sacrifice. So all the Israelites, during the Passover, for instance, all the Israelites, they would come at the same time, and they would need to offer sacrifice. Well, they're coming from all over the place. So in order for them to offer sacrifice, they have to buy the animal. Okay, so the animals were typically raised in Bethlehem. They were brought to Jerusalem, where the temple was, in order to be sacrificed. And there would be people there selling these animals to all of these pilgrims that are coming from all over the place. Well, the thing is that they wanted to make money out of this. So instead of just selling, these animals at a fair rate, they would have a different currency that would be called the temple money, okay? And what would happen is you would have to, in order to buy these animals, you would have to convert your money into the temple money, and then using the temple money, you would buy the animal. And so these money changers, they were essentially currency converters. They would take your money, charge you a fee, give you the temple money, and then with the temple money, you buy the animal. okay? And they were charging exorbitant fees because they wanted to make money off of this. It was very lucrative for them. This was every single person in Israel was coming to offer these sacrifices. And so what was happening is it was keep preventing people from being able to buy the animal and offer the sacrifice and practice the Passover, right? As God had commanded. And so Jesus, seeing this, was furious, right? It's like you have turned my house into a den of robbers. That's what he said. So the idea that it is our job to identify what are the things in our home or in our lives personally that are like these money changers. They are kind of connecting us to a worldly system as opposed to the heavenly system. Like God is wanting, like the temple worship is all about being right with God, reconciliation with God. And yet these people, they were injecting this love of money, this earthly kind of mindset into that, to where it was preventing people from doing so. So we ask ourselves the same question, like what is it in my life that is preventing me from worshiping? Is it my love of money? Is it because I want to spend so much time working? Is it a gambling addiction? Is it a stock market addiction? Is it my desire for certain kinds of ungodly entertainment, right? Is it alcohol? Is it drugs? Like cleanse all the things that are keeping you from worship, right? Yes. Yeah, so service can be also because, like I said before, sometimes we equate service with like spirituality. And it should be, right? It should be that, when we serve God, it's also helping us draw closer to God. But even service can become an idol, right? Like, for instance, it's possible that we never read the Bible unless we're preparing a Sunday school lesson. It's possible that we never read any spiritual book unless we want to give a talk about it. It's possible that the only reason we learn hymns is so that we can stand in the liturgy and say the hymn and, perform well in front of the people. We take spirituality away from the things that are intended to be spiritual, right? And this is a problem, right, that we have and something that each of us has to kind of ask ourselves, like, am I doing this? Like the hymns, for instance, in the church, are they prayer at all for us? Like, do we even try to pray in the hymn? Like, that's the whole purpose of the hymn. Right? Not just so that we can memorize the hezet of the hymn and like sound really nice and everyone can be like, wow, this person's a great, and the deacons are fighting over the microphone, right? So definitely, right? Like anything, even the things that appear godly from the outside. A perfect example is the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, right? Like in this parable, Christ rebuked this Pharisee who stood up to pray, and his prayer was all about thanking God for how righteous that he was and how he fasts and how he does all this stuff, but he's not like this tax collector. And the content of the prayer reflected that his heart was all about being showy and not about the true spirit of what prayer should be. So we all, reflect and we ask ourselves, what are the hindrances that we place in worship? And you can also study like the Old Testament. There's tons of examples in the Old Testament about, purification and what does it mean? I'm not going to get into all of that. But that's definitely something for us to see, like the idea of cleansing, in the Old Testament, it was seen that leprosy, the sin of leprosy, was a consequence of sin. Okay. And the sin of leprosy was not the same leprosy that we know of today as leprosy. Okay. It was some other kind of disease, infectious disease. And the reason is because there are times where it says a house could get leprosy. Like you could have a house that is infected with leprosy. And what is it that they would do to this house? They would take everything out of the house. They would cleanse the entire house. And then at the end of after doing all this cleansing, the priest determined that there is still leprosy, they would burn the house, right? So this image, imagine of there is some disease that is present in this house, and we have to look at it and spend all this effort trying to cleanse it, to purify it, even to take everything out. And this goes again to the decluttering, right? Decluttering is I'm taking away things that are excessive, that are unnecessary, that are distracting. This is exactly what they would be doing in order for them to cleanse this house. Yes.
eat nothing ritual that happened down the planet.
No, it is a physical disease. I'm just saying it's not the same leprosy that we call leprosy today. But it was a physical disease, yes. And it was an infectious disease. And the reason I say that is because leprosy is not something that can infect the house, right? But this disease is something that could infect the entire house, an actual physical disease. Yeah. In James 4:8, it says, "Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded." Right? So when we draw near to God, God responds and comes near to us. And then he says, cleanse your hands, right? Cleanse your hands. Sometimes we think that, okay, God doesn't hear me. Or people will say, I feel like God does not hear my prayer, okay? There are some times where we know what it is that we should be doing, but we don't do it. And then we say, well, why is it God not answering my prayer? Right? If there is something that I don't know about myself, let's say there is a sin that's hidden from my eyes, it's a blind spot that I have, this is one thing, right? But if we examine ourselves and we find some things, we're not going to find everything, but we find some things that we know need to change. But then we don't take any steps or any action, right? Why is it that God would hear me at that point? Like, we always are asking God, like, God, what is your will? Help me to know what is it that I should be doing? Why is it that God would tell us his will? Why is it that God would communicate with us when he's already communicated something, right? The idea that maybe there's a certain area of my life that needs to change, but we have refused to change it. We have refused to even take one step to change it, right? Change is difficult, but what is the first step to change, right? This is something we ask ourselves, right? Like, what is the first step that I need to take in order to correct something? I'm not asking you to correct it, right? Because asking a person to correct something all in one step is impossible. The idea is if you were to write down all the things that are necessary step by step that would have to happen in order to change it, just look at the very first one. What is the first step, right? Is it that I go and meet with my father of confession? Is that I select the father of confession? Is it that, that I pray about it? Whatever it is the first step to change, that should be the first thing that I do. And that is definitely within my ability. Maybe I say it is not within my ability to change myself in an area where I have struggled for decades. But it is within my ability to take the first step to do so. And then from there, then maybe God will open the door for the second step, will give me the courage to do the second step, will help me have support to do the second step, and so on. And so we also are doing this in our homes, right? Like creating this atmosphere of repentance, creating an atmosphere like, you know what, I'm going to be sure I know when my kid's next appointment for confession is. And they're going to know when my next appointment for confession is, because we're all confessing together, right? My family is going to see me stopping certain behaviors and activities that are ungodly, right? Our kids know us better than anyone. The people at church or the people at work or the people wherever, like, they don't see us in our homes or what we do in our homes, but our kids see. So in some sense, our kids see the worst of us, right? They see the unfiltered version of us, and that will affect them if we're not careful about cleansing ourselves and growing ourselves as well. Also, decluttering time commitments. Okay, this is complicated because we all have a lot of time commitments. Okay, so again, evaluate our commitments. What are our goals? And then figure out what things are occupying our time, are actually applicable to our goals, are helping us to achieve our goals versus not, right? Like, if we find ourselves that a lot of the things that we spend our time doing are actually not beneficial, are not helping us to achieve the goals that we've placed for ourselves as being the best and most important things that we're trying to do, then those are the first things to cut out, right? The first things to cut out. And, either you'll find that we spend a lot of time relaxing, resting. Maybe this is the struggle of a person who struggles with laziness, right? A person who doesn't want to use their time for a lot of things except themselves, okay? Or maybe you'll find that we're very busy all the time, but what is the nature of that busyness, right? What are we busy to do? And you have to ask yourself, there are some things that are negative that we need to remove, and there's actually some things that are neutral that need to remove. For instance, many families, they have this discussion. It's like, are our kids involved in too many after-school activities, right? Sports and music and all kinds of gymnastics, other things. Why does that question arise? Well, those things are not bad, right, in and of themselves, and they're actually good. But there's also the possibility of there being too excessive, right? Because if I'm finding myself that my evening after I come home from work is nothing but driving my kids around, and they're going out doing this, and they're doing homework on the fly, everything is like chaotic, and then we get home, we got to take a shower, we got to go to sleep, and you wake up tomorrow and you do the whole thing again. It's like, well, okay, yeah, sports are good, but what are you paying in order to put your kids into that, right? Like there was a person who, they had their kid in baseball, and it was like a very rigorous baseball program where they would have, games on Sundays. They would have to miss, 3 out of 4 liturgies, per month. And it was a very successful program, and their kid was actually very good at baseball, and they were doing very well, right? So, but then it's a question. It's like, so what is more important? Is it more important that you do really well in baseball? Or is it important that you're able to come to the liturgy on Sunday, go to Sunday school, and so on? Baseball is not a sin. It's fine. And if you're able to manage it in a way that doesn't, contradict or interfere with other things that are more important, then fine. But that's the hard questions that we have to ask ourselves. I mentioned before, like about your career, are you working, 80 hours a week, not because of necessity, right? There are some people who out of necessity because they can't afford life otherwise, and they have to work 2 jobs, they have to work a lot of time. That's one thing. That's a necessity. But sometimes we work excessively not because of necessity, because of the job we've chosen, the career we've chosen, the goals we set, our professional goals that we've set, cause us to work this much. And, the fallacy that sometimes people fall into is, I'm only going to do it for a few years. I'm only going to do it at the beginning, right? Because I have to establish myself, and I have to make a name for myself, and I have to get in the door. And then once I'm in, then everything's going to calm down, everything's going to become easier, I'm going to have more time. Unfortunately, that usually doesn't happen. It's like when they say they're going to make a toll road, and then once it pays off the road, they're going to cancel the tolls. Okay, it probably doesn't happen, right? Because once you get there and you're used to a certain level of accomplishment, money, whatever it is, right? Then you're like, well, okay, now how do I just let go of that, right? Letting go of that is not easy, right? And so part of this is knowing yourself, know yourself. Like I can tell you about myself. Like if you put me in a situation where, I'm making very high salary, but, I'm having to work 80 hours a week or whatever, that's going to be hard for me to let go, right? And I'm going to make excuses to not want to let it go. I'm going to be saying to myself, like, well, everything will be fine. Oh, my wife will pick up the slack. It goes to what Abuna was talking about, being present, like love equals time. If you ask the question, are my kids being taken care of? Yeah, they're not living on the street. And financially, they're very well taken care of, and they have a house, and they have their own rooms, and they have food, and they have private school, and they have all the things that they would ever need. But they don't have me, right? Because I've sacrificed myself all the time that I can have with them in order to pursue goals, which if we're very honest with ourselves, even though we say, yeah, we're doing it for them, yeah, but we're really doing it for us, right? It is for them, but it's also for us. We extract pleasure from it. We feel fulfillment and satisfaction in it, and that's why we do it, right? And so it is a pursuit, it's a goal that I've set for myself. And setting a lower goal is possible. Looking for something that gives me more time and flexibility is possible. So evaluate your commitments, evaluate how you're spending your time, and be open-minded with this, because it's very easy to shut everything down and just say, no, I can't. Prioritizing family time, right? We talked about having meals together, praying together, whatever shared activities, games we play together. Have good, enjoyable time with your family, right? It shouldn't all be about chores and homework and discipline and, like formal stuff. It should be about enjoying each other's time, enjoying each other's presence. And again, schedule it. Like if your schedule is very packed and this doesn't happen organically, make it happen. Just like you would schedule anything else in your schedule. Make it happen. Give a time for this on a daily or semi-daily basis to enjoy time with your family together, like a sacred time that you're not going to sacrifice for anything. Also, setting boundaries is very important, meaning when the person, whether at church, whether at wherever, they come to you and they're like, hey, we need you to work more. Your boss comes, hey, we need you to work more. Yeah, this is a difficult conversation to have, right? But you have to have it, and you can be very clear with it. It's like, I can't. Like if, again, it goes back to your priorities. Like if you have a priority that you need to spend time with your family and be present with your family, and if that's more important to you, then okay, you can find another job. You will find another job. Maybe you'll get passed over for promotion because you aren't the yes person, the yes man who's just going to say yes to everything your boss says. You're going to work unlimited amount of time. I understand that there are some seasons of life where there's exceptional cases. But if you find that this has become now the norm, where you are always away, right? Then you have to be able to set that boundary and say, no, sorry, I can't do that, right? And don't do that, do that boldly. I can't. Like, I own my time. Nobody else owns it for me, right? I choose for myself how I want to live my life. Sometimes we find ourselves living life like victims, and even it's reflected in the way we talk. We're like, oh, I have to go to work. Oh, I have to go to church. I have to do this, as though everything we are doing is compelled against our will to do. No, I choose to go to work, and I choose to go to church, and I choose to go and spend time with my family. These are all personal choices. Nobody is forcing you against your will to make any of the decisions that you're making. Certainly, every decision has its consequences, right? But in the end, right, we make decisions for ourselves, and we bear the consequences for those decisions, right? So don't live life victimized, right? You set the boundaries, and you own your time. You own your life. Nobody else owns it except you. Your boss doesn't own it. Even your spouse doesn't own it, right? When you choose to spend time with your family, it is not because you are compelled against your will. It should be because you want to, because you see that the value of it. It's important. You're not going to do it because someone is pressuring you. You're going to do it because it's valuable. Also, there's the physical decluttering, okay? Like, get rid of junk, right? Maybe we don't think about this one as much, like when we speak about like the spiritual life, but actually our environments affect us. Like when you go to the church, for instance, and you find that everything is in a certain order, and you know what to expect when you go into church. And Abuna mentioned this, I think, in his first talk. You know what to expect when you come to church. Any Orthodox church, right, in the world, supposed to be, like, set up a certain way. Different people, different ranks, staying in different places. The hymns that we chant are all the same hymns, in every church. According to the day, the readings that we read in the church are all the same everywhere in the world. And so this creates a sense of peace. The icons, the smell of the incense, the altar, so many things that bring peace and comfort and predictability to the environment that helps remove distractions for people to worship God in the church. So also in our house, if we find that our house is just full of junk, always scattered around everywhere, right? Then this can be anxiety, causing. At least for some people. Some people are so accustomed to it, they don't even notice it. But most people, I would say, benefit from having a physically decluttered environment. It helps bring order and peace to the house. Also, it's something you can involve your family to do, right? It's everyone's responsibility to keep their space clean, right? This is when we tell kids, clean your room, okay? Don't just clean your room, keep it clean. Like, there's a difference between cleaning your room and keeping it clean. Clean your room means I'm going to let it become a disaster for a week, and then on the one day of the week I'm supposed to clean my room, I'm going to clean it. So how often does it actually stay clean? Very, very little, right? Keeping your room clean means, okay, like whenever it's time to put your dirty clothes away, there's a place for your dirty clothes. It's called the hamper, right? Don't just throw it on the ground, right? So I think there is a distinction between keeping your house clean versus cleaning your house, right? And this is true spiritually as well. Like spiritually, it's like we don't say, okay, commit whatever sins that you want, mess up as much as you want, but then confess and now you're clean, and then go back again, do whatever sins you want, but just make sure to set in a confession appointment. No. That would be cleaning your house, but it's not keeping your house clean. Keeping your house clean means I'm going to make an effort all throughout my life to keep myself from falling into sin. Just like in my house, I'm going to make effort to keep my house from becoming disordered, right? And this is true across the board with everything. Create a peaceful atmosphere, right? Have a place for prayer, right? Like we speak about the importance of having like a prayer room or a prayer corner, a place that is unspotted from the world, a place that is separate from anything else. We don't do anything else in this place except we pray together. And so again, it creates a peaceful atmosphere. It creates it reminds us every time we walk by, it reminds us, oh, I'm supposed to pray. Oh, I'm supposed to come here and do this. It reminds us the importance of it. Finally, setting priorities based on values. Okay? Our priorities should be based on values. So identify what are your core values, okay? What are your core values, the things that matter to you the most? Obviously, there's going to be spiritual things in there, but there's going to be also non-spiritual things, right? What are your core values? Determine what matters to you the most, and then make sure that all of your decisions are aligned with these values, okay? Make sure all your decisions are aligned with these values, and then finally, adjust as needed. And this is a constant process that we are doing all the time. Maybe the first time we do it, it's going to take a lot of time because we've never done it before. We've never really thought about it before. But once you begin to identify, okay, that maybe there are some things in my priorities and my decisions that are not aligned, right? Then start making those difficult decisions and start aligning things. And maybe don't try to blow it all up at once. One thing at a time. Right? Focus on one thing at a time. What's one thing, one priority that I have that's not aligned with my decisions? I change that decision. I make a different decision. And when you do it with yourself, it's one thing. When you do it with your family, it's kind of like, you're going to turn a really large ship. If you're going to U-turn a really large ship, you're not going to just immediately turn on a dime. Because if you did that, the whole ship is going to crash. Like if a priest comes into a church and says, okay, everything in this church is messed up. Everyone comes late. This and this is not working. The orban is bad. The deacons don't know how to chant hymns. This is that. And I'm going to try to change everything simultaneously. What's going to happen is an explosion. And they're going to kick me out of the church. You focus on one thing that you feel is the most important and you emphasize it over and over and over until you change the habit. Once the habit is changed, whether in yourself or in your family, now I can now go to the next thing, okay? So you do it slowly. Again, think of it as this large ship. You're trying to turn it gradually to point it in the right direction. You can't do that instantly, right? The more people that you're leading, the slower they will turn, okay? So do it slowly. But always reevaluate and always look at what's happening. It's like, okay, is this the right way? Is this the right approach? Are these decisions the right ones? Keep adjusting it until it is. But again, who's going to step up to do any of these things, right? Who's going to step up to do it? These activities require you to step out of the busy whirlwind of the world and to start looking at your life very proactively, very intentionally. Because none of these things we're talking about is going to naturally pop out of your schedule. Like if you're trying to wait for some moment in your schedule to open up so that you can start doing these things, if you're busy, it's not going to happen, right? That's why we tend not to think about these things. Like we're always just thinking, what's the next thing? Okay, I have an appointment at this time, and then I have to take my kids to this, and then I have to go to church and serve this, and then I have to go to work and do that, and then I have to travel, and then it's so many things, one after the other. In order to do what we're talking about, you kind of have to stop and be like, okay, this activity that I have to do, there's not going to be a good time for it. There's not going to be a good time to pause my schedule or to make time in my schedule. We're going to all be busy. You just say, this is so important, I have to do it. And I'm going to make time to do it, and maybe make time to do it on a weekly basis to reevaluate and to think about how things are going and so on. So keep adjusting and keep working on this. It's our role as the leaders of the house and leaders of ourselves to do this with ourselves. So in summary, we had 7 points. The first one was the spiritual decluttering. repentance, confession, removing the burdens of sin in our lives. The second is removing idols, the things that prevent us from worshiping God. Embracing forgiveness. Don't carry hatred in your heart for other people and bring that with you. 4, cleansing, and looking at the biblical examples of cleansing and how Christ cleansed the temple. Decluttering time commitments, figure out how we should be spending our time the most efficiently. Physical decluttering of the space that we're in. And then finally, setting priorities based on values and reevaluating again and again.